Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint Office 365 and Azure Community webinar. My name is Shane and I'm delighted to be joined by Mihai Tataran, MVP and Microsoft Regional Director of Virgo SRL Romania, who will be talking to you today about cloud strategy for your organization, how to start. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC19. Don't forget to check out the Resource Center. This is packed with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. Simply visit SharePointEurope.com and click the content link at the top. Recently, we launched the ESPC19 program, which is full of Microsoft leaders, a fantastic speaker lineup, and a broad range of topics. See for yourself at SharePointEurope.com. After the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any questions you have for Mihai in the questions window. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and added to the Resource Center, where you will be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass you over to our webinar presenter, Mihai Tataran. Hello, Mihai.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. Just sharing my screen. Please, can you confirm that you see my screen now?
Yep, that's great. Mihai, take it away.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, hello, everyone. This is Mihai. Before we start, just a few words about myself. My day-to-day job is to manage Avelco, which is a MSP, Microsoft, a managed services partner focused on Microsoft Cloud, based in Romania with customers all over the world. Recently, I've taken over the job of CEO at Internology, which is a California-based custom app dev, AI, machine learning, VR company, very specialized also on Microsoft technology. I'm an MVP, Azure MVP, and Microsoft Regional Director, which means I'm in close contact with the people from Microsoft who actually build the Azure technologies, and the people from Microsoft who are designing the business strategy for the long-term future. I'm also involved in community events. For example, I co-organize IT Camp, which is a conference we host. We just had our 9th edition this year in Transylvania. It's for community people, for developers and IT pros. We have speakers from all over the world, and it's usually very, very fun. So this is me. I'm still a technical person. I'm still involved in workshops, trainings, and key projects, especially focused on Azure work. It could be migrations, it could be rewriting apps for Azure, it could be greenfield apps designed from the beginning for Azure, and so on and so forth. The objectives for today's webinar would be, how do I define a strategy to move to the cloud, especially from, let's say, from the beginning. I don't have anything in Azure. I don't have anything in Microsoft 365. What's my strategy to go there? But probably you'll find it useful even if you are in an intermediary state. And we're going to focus not only on technical challenges, but also on other aspects which are very, very relevant to such a migration project. Before we go into the details, first of all, why the cloud? I still feel this question is relevant, especially in Europe, where we all live usually, because sometimes I meet with customers, and typically one of the first people I meet at customers are IT managers or CIOs, and some of them still don't see the cloud as it should be seen. Some of them just see it as another location for some servers, for some machines, right? Which is not. I mean, if you only see Azure as just another place to put your VMs, you're probably not going to be efficient. You're not going to really get benefits from what the cloud means. And I'm referring to things like, platform as a service, services out of the box, features that we get in the cloud that for which you would have normally to work on your own. So there's still a huge gap between the reality, what the cloud is, and the perception. The gap is narrowing day by day, especially in the US, in Western Europe, but there's still a gap somewhere in many of the countries in Europe. What I have seen, especially in the US market, because we're very much acquainted to this market, here I think the biggest thing to mention is that we are facing the second wave. If you are familiar with crossing the chasm, an imaginary chasm, right, which would signify that the majority of the people don't embrace a technology from the start. At the beginning, you have innovators, you have people who are more curious, and then the majority of the market will follow through when they have enough evidence that this is a good way to go. Well, in the US especially, we are seeing the second wave now. So they have crossed the chasm. That's a big thing. Another thing which is happening in the US already, big companies are switching away from the multi-cloud model to a single cloud model. So 3-4 years ago, large companies would say, we don't want to have all our eggs in a single basket. We want to try AWS and Azure, or maybe another cloud provider. Now they're shying away because they have found out on their own that cost management, governance, contract management is too complicated if you have to discuss or to work with two different cloud providers. So that's the reality today. This is very new. It's I don't know, a few months old, so to speak, this perception in the market. And their biggest concern, so large companies, especially here in the US, is related to cost management and governance. Because one of the beautiful things with Azure is that you pay as you go. You pay for exactly what you need, or in theory, that's what you can do because the technology is there and the business model is there. But the risk is for you not to actually pay for what you need, but by mistake, you leave a lot of resources which shouldn't be there. You forget to close them down. You don't do automation. You don't do auto scaling, other things which turn off or turn down the resources when you don't need them at all, or you don't need them as much. So this is one of the primary concerns, especially for large organizations who I don't know, consume, and we have customers like this who consume tens of thousands of euros per month, or even hundreds of thousands of euros per month. There, a 15, 20, 25% cost reduction because of, just the examples that I just mentioned, resources that are not used. It's a big cost reduction. Okay, let me move to the next one. How about Microsoft? I'm very much involved in this world. We work with the Microsoft Cloud, so Azure and Office 365. What I can tell you is that they are investing a lot in AI, right? If today's bet or yesterday's bet was Azure and the cloud in general, tomorrow's bet is AI. And what we have seen very recently is that there are a lot of projects within the Microsoft AI space which are astonishing. So in some cases, for example, with language understanding or object recognition, they're at 98, 99% of human parity. I'm talking about deep learning. I'm talking about Microsoft research projects mostly. I'm not specifically talking about the cognitive services. So the, let's say, out-of-the-box machine learning models that you get as a service, which are called cognitive services. I'm talking about more advanced projects right now, but technology is there. So this is very, very, very important. When it comes to the cloud, Microsoft has decided to do a lot of integration, a vertical integration if you want. They invest in FPGAs. So they have their own chipsets, which they program to allow faster networking in their data centers. They have their own chipsets that they program for deep neural networks. They have designed new data center architectures. So the next wave will be even more efficient. We're talking about 1.07, if I remember correctly. This kind of efficiency, so this number 1.07, whereas the industry standard would be 1.6 today, is the amount of total energy consumed divided by energy which actually gets to the servers. So if the industry standard is at 1.6 and they're closing 1.07, you can imagine they're much more efficient than the majority of the competition. And that's that kind of innovation, right? Bringing energy production as close to the servers as possible is bringing the Azure prices down. Okay, hope it makes sense. Now, a very, very short introduction to Azure before we move to our actual main subject. First of all, they have invested a lot and they continue to invest. They have 54 regions worldwide. By region, we mean a collection of zones of data centers. In Europe, they have Dublin and Amsterdam. They have been there for a long time. They have the UK, Germany regions, which I have to explain just very, very shortly. Maybe if you're from Germany or from the UK, you need to know this. So a few years ago, they thought that it is a good thing, well, the market said that it's a good thing for them to build data centers, regions in Germany, for example, which are to be operated by a local company. So not only customers' data would reside on German soil, but also the operations of those data centers are not done by a US company, by Microsoft. They are done by Deutsche Telekom or British Telecom in the UK. Well, the strategy has changed, and those regions will be closed down. I'm not even sure if you find them today in the Azure portal when you try to create new resources. I think you don't anymore. Instead, they decided to build their own regions, even in Germany, even in the UK, because the market changed their mind, right? Those regions used to be more expensive. They lacked or they were behind with features because it's a third party which operates those regions, and now they're going to have full-fledged Azure data centers in Germany, in Switzerland, and so on and so forth. How do we start? Well, when we approach a customer and they need to move towards the cloud, it's usually a long process with many steps. This is just a glimpse or an example of such steps. One of the things we do in the beginning is related to identities. In Europe, GDPR is still a big thing, or it's starting to become a big thing. So it could be related to that as well, but mostly consolidating identities. We always tell our customers that if you want to have a successful story with your IT environment in the cloud, you need to have just one identity per user. If you have Active Directory, so local AD, and you also use Gmail and G Drive, and you also have Office 365 for, I don't know, SharePoint or something else, and your users actually use 2 or 3 different identities, you're going to have a huge problem managing that in terms of authorization, in terms of being compliant with the data, and so on and so forth. So that's one of the foundational things we address at the beginning. And then we usually try to do, the low-hanging fruits, migrate VMs, migrate things which are easy to migrate without any kind of modernization or transformation, to use Microsoft terminology. Of course, do a business a backup, business continuity plan, disaster recovery plan, and then we start modernizing. So maybe changing or adapting existing applications to use as much of the platform as a service as possible, and then later on optimizing or innovating, right, using machine learning or using analytics. And it all finishes, if you want, even if it's not a sequential step, this doesn't come at the end, with a state of peace of mind. This is how we call it. This is a service that we have in our company, in Avelgo. Peace of mind means that you have things running in Azure and you're safe, right? They are managed, somebody's taking care of them, and you're, focusing on your business. Now, very, very shortly, if the scope of the migration would be a solution. So I have an existing app which I have to move to Azure, and this is not the purpose of this session, but just briefly to go through that, because our scope level is much higher at the organizational level. Well, first of all, there are many ways to host code, to run code in Azure. You have VMs, you have containers, you have VM scale sets, you have different types of containers. Then you have the cloud services, which are, well, basically dead. You have app services, web apps, you have service fabric, you have functions. So a lot of options to run code. And those options, which I personally like, there are many, could create confusion, right? So you have to know exactly what you're doing. But in general, so very, very simplified, there's a big choice between infrastructure as a service, so running your apps, your code onto VMs, versus using functions, web apps, so anything in the platform as a service space. Now, if we're talking about migrating an existing application with infrastructure as a service, with the left-hand approach on this slide, it's a low-risk approach. You simply take your application, which is running today on a VM or some VMs on premises, and you simply put them onto VMs in Azure, and they will run. What's not so good about it, you're not efficient. You didn't optimize for cost. You simply rent out some VMs in Azure. The platform as a service migration means probably that you have to change some of the configurations of the application, of the software that you're moving, which is good. In some cases, it changes, or it means you have to change your architecture, your topology of your solution. If it's an N-tier solution, and today, I don't know, on your own premises, you have a front-end layer and a middle layer, both on the same machine. If you move them to Azure, to platform as a service, and you decide to use web apps and functions, respectively, then you separated those layers. Those layers, which are probably very chatty, on premises you don't care about it, all the communication happens on the same machine. Well, in Azure, you're not on the same machine anymore. You are using two services for those two layers. So topology might be affected. So a deep analysis is needed, but this is the way to become much more efficient in terms of cost, in terms of managing those resources, because those features simply exist and there's somebody else making them run. There are a few, let's say, things to have in mind, to bear in mind when it comes to an existing solution. If it's modern or legacy, meaning, do I have, I don't know, a lot of data in the session? Do I use state? Do I have, I don't know, hard-coded strings, things like that? Topology, I just gave you an example. If an N-tier or multi-tier solution needs to move, be aware how the topology changes. Transient faults, this is very specific to Azure. Azure being, or many of the services in Azure being serviced from a distributed environment from a multi-tenant environment, things like SQL DB, things like table storage, and so on. Sometimes when your code targets a SQL DB, it wants to write something into a database. Maybe the database is not available at that specific moment. We call it a transient fault. It's an error which is happening temporary because of the environment. It's not because of your code. It's not a bug in your application. It's something which has to do with other customers using the same infrastructure your SQL database is served from. So you have to think about handling exceptions in a different way. and so on and so forth. So many other things you need to consider. We don't have the time now to go through all of those. How not to do it, and this is an example I encountered. Almost a 2-year a 2-year long, 16 devs solution development decision to move to Azure because they have users worldwide. The project to move to Azure is a 3-man days project. That's how they estimated it. So 16 people developed a solution working almost 2 years. Suddenly I have to move it to Azure. This is not a 3-man days project, I can tell you that, right? Nobody thought about the architecture, about the topology, about services they need to use, and nobody thought about CI/CD. How is that changing? Nobody thought about logs. How do I capture instrumentation? Things like that, right? This is how we did it with um, a very simple case, a company which is a gas distributor which had a hardware crash. They were using SAP. In this very simple case, we decided to lift and shift because their hardware crashed, so they needed SAP to work. We simply migrated the solution to Azure as it is without changing anything. So we simply created some VMs there. Their immediate benefit was cost reduction and better disaster recovery. And this serves as a very good starting point for our next section, which is scope level, which is the organization scope level, right? So many times it's not as simple as that. I just, get some VMs and move them to Azure. Many times we're talking about migrating the entire organization. So how do we approach this? We have defined in our company a practice which divides such projects into two. Very simple ones, which are not going to refer to today, standard, small apps, small organizations. We have predefined packages for those, but this is not the purpose of this talk. We're talking about custom or bespoke services, complex projects, complex organizations. How do we do those? Well, very simplified. We use high-level consultants throughout all our interaction with our customers. So we use our very specialized people in pre-sales. We use them in delivery. We use them afterwards. So it's a lot of knowledge which is captured in a few key people, which of course brings us a risk or a tension because it's very hard to scale those people. But we found the model to do it in the end as well. What would be a driver for migrating for such a customer? There are many reasons to go to Azure or to the cloud in general. Sometimes they simply want to become more efficient, reduce cost, or within the same budget, do more, or simply use things like out-of-the-box features. I'll give you a very simple example. VMs in Azure have disaster recovery enabled. I mean, if a VM crashes or becomes unavailable for whatever reason, Azure will recreate that VM. In platform as a service like SQL DB or I don't know, web apps, you get the quality of service, which tells you the level of performance to expect and the uptime to expect. So it's usually 99.99% uptime, and the level of performance, well, depending on the feature that you're using. Another reason could be a new company or a startup. So they are just beginning. They don't have legacy, which is great. They don't have existing IT. They just decide to move to Azure or to the cloud. It's easier. So that's, of course, a very easy thing to do. Another reason would be access to technology. So things like machine learning or analytics, big data, they are not, not very possible to do those on premises. You need a lot of hardware to do that. So it's not feasible to install such software and such hardware on premises. Just think about Hadoop, right? How easy is it to install a Hadoop cluster on premises? It's very complicated and it costs a lot. Whereas in Azure, you have HD Insight. It's a service which is already there. And many other reasons, including GDPR. So in Europe, that's big. You have already services built in the Microsoft 365 ecosystem, which help us a lot with the GDPR. And we did it for many customers, especially last year. It cooled down a bit. Probably it's going to get big again. Things like data classification, Azure Rights Management Services, and so on. So when an organization, a company decides to go to the cloud in general, this is a long project. Usually it's a complex project. So when it's I don't know, a large organization with multiple offices spread all over the world with tens of thousands of people, it usually takes months just to design the architecture for doing that, because you need to get input from many parties, like the IT, the networking people, the security people, the app people, applications people, and so on and so forth. It's a complicated thing. It usually gets divided into a set of projects which go sequentially. Most of the time, it doesn't start from a clean state, meaning the current infrastructure might not be consolidated. So there might be different offices with different active directories, with different domains, or not all their workload is virtualized. They use physical machines for some workloads. Sometimes they already have things in the cloud, Azure, AWS, or both. And that's a complicated state to start from. Or sometimes they use Gmail for email and OneDrive and SharePoint from Office 365, right? So you have to start to consolidate the identities first in this case, or you have to start to virtualize workloads before you move to Azure, because you cannot move physical machines to Azure, right? Then there's geography. Users might reside on different continents, so their email should be as close to them as possible if we're talking about Microsoft 365. Their data should be as close as possible, or their applications should be as close as possible if you're talking about Azure. Then there are financials, HR, and even management considerations, which we'll go through immediately. So let's say the initial state is not as clean as we would like. One of the first things we do is consolidate identities. Worst case scenario would be have federated identities. So even if the users actually have two identity providers, we should have some kind of federation between those. But the best way to go is to have just one consolidated identity. And we certainly recommend Microsoft Azure Active Directory, Azure AD, which synchronizes with AD on premises, which leverages another set of scenarios like apps from the Office 365 ecosystem, like third-party apps that you can have single sign-on with. So it's much easier if you have the whole organization use a single identity, so everybody with a single username, because then all the other, single sign-on management of the applications becomes much easier. And of course, this is one very simple example of what you can do when you have a single identity. Well, you use all the other services in Office 365. Maybe I should explain this further just a bit. Azure Active Directory is the same directory used by Office 365. So when you have an Office 365 tenant and you have users there, those users are actually kept in an Azure AD. It's the same thing. So when you have users in Azure AD in a tenant, they have access to, of course, you have to purchase Office 365 services, but those identities have access to those services. And it's very easy for you to control authorization, permissions, and so on. And of course, then you can come further with Azure Identity Protection, simply classifying folders and files within your SharePoint and OneDrive um, ecosystem, protect those, and then do authorization. So I'll give you a very simplified example. You can define your own labels in your company, saying, for example, that I don't know, I have public files, I have private or internal files, and I have very confidential files. And you can apply those labels to the scope that you want, per file or per folder in OneDrive and SharePoint. And for each label, you can define the group of users who have access to that label, to those files which the label corresponds to. And by access, I mean you can give them read-only access, you can give them write access, and so on. So whenever you edit a document in Word, right, and you apply that label to it, that file will be encrypted and saved encrypted on OneDrive and SharePoint. And whenever a user wants to open that file, a authentication will be requested. And if that user belongs to the group which has been associated to that label and has the rights to open the file, they would be able to do so. And this applies to your own Office 365 environment, so your own users, but also other domains. So you can share documents with third parties in a secured way. And this is very, very good for GDPR purposes as well. This is an out-of-the-box feature that you use, but you can only use it after you have consolidated your identities. Now, again, talking about the initial state, let's say all the workloads have been virtualized. You don't have physical machines anymore, and you want to migrate VMs to Azure. There are standardized approaches to migrate Hyper-V VMs or VMware VMs, for example, to Azure. There are standardized procedures, there are tools for doing that, but first of all, you have to be virtualized. Geography is another very important consideration. So I have to think about how Azure regions are created, right? So we have the notion of geographies, which is a boundary, if you want. A geography would be a boundary within which we have some Azure regions. That's how we call them. For example, EU would be such a geography. And it's usually mapping on a set of laws regarding data residency or data compliance. A region within a geography is a set of data centers, right? And within the regions, we have very, very good latencies. For example, I don't know, West Europe, I'll give you an example, right? Within West Europe or North Europe, within that region, between those data centers, you usually have 1 millisecond latency, less than 2 millisecond latency, which is great, right? Okay. Then intra-region. So inside the region, you have what we call availability zones. They're designed for high availability, even higher availability. Usually a VM in Azure has 99.5% uptime if it's a single VM. Then you have 99.95% uptime. No, sorry, it was 99.9% uptime if it's a single VM. And you have 99.95% uptime if it's two VMs in an availability set. But availability zones are even more. You can put 3 VMs in 3 separate zones in a single region, and I have 99.99% uptime for VMs. It's basically different data centers within the same region, divided by zones for better resiliency. And this is what you get from 99.9, so 3 nines to 4 nines, depending on the features that you use. availability zones would be, of course, the most expensive, but also the best. Again, talking about geography, there are a lot of services which out of the box can be replicated between regions. An example in this picture would be SQL database. So that's the platform as a service offering. It's a SQL DB, but you don't have to manage the server behind it. It's as a service. Now it comes with geo-replication. So you can choose to be replicated in a master-slave scenario onto other regions for redundancy, right? For better performance. If we talk about Office 365, email, for example, you would want users' data, so email and files in SharePoint, for example, to be as close to them as possible. If you're an organization which has people on multiple continents, you can create a thing called multi-geo. So you have the tenant somewhere in Europe, let's say it's defined in Europe as a main headquarter, but you have satellites in Australia and the US respectively. And you can choose which users to be hosted where, meaning their email and SharePoint data. You have a single tenant, you don't manage multiple tenants, it's just one tenant, and their data is close to them. Now we have to be aware of the data center's locations. We talk about two different services. So Office 365, that's Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, and so on. It's a set of services hosted by some data centers. Azure, it's a different thing. So it's not mandatory that if you have some users, I don't know, working from Netherlands or from Norway, their Office 365 services might be served from Finland, where you have Exchange Online, but their Azure content will be served from Amsterdam, where where an Azure region is. So the interaction between Office 365 assets and Azure Active Directory assets is not happening within a data center. It happens over the web. Now, there's another aspect if we think about migrating orgs to Azure, and this is hugely important. I have to stress this out today because it's a big change in Microsoft that's happening this year. So originally, or this is what we're used to today, there are multiple ways to purchase Azure. There used to be, doesn't exist anymore, a program for startups where they get credits. That's called BSpark. But it was basically, just buying Azure from the website, which is the pay-as-you-go (PAYG) option in this slide, and then there would be reimbursed for that consumption. The first option that we have today is pay-as-you-go. You just simply go to the website and purchase Azure. Then you can purchase Azure in an open license. I think that's the name. You go to a distributor and you purchase a bucket of Azure, usually in buckets of $100 each. And then there's an enterprise agreement, which is you sign a 3-year contract, you pay the first year in advance, and then you have a large bucket of Azure you have to consume. And then there's cloud solution provider, CSP. You have a contract with a partner, with a CSP partner, and you purchase from them Azure paying as you go. So at the end of the month, you get an invoice with what you have consumed. Multiple ways of purchasing Azure with, pros and cons. I won't insist too much on those pros and those cons today because they are changing in the future, but very, very simplified. EAs have been designed for large contracts, large organizations, which are able to manage their relationship with Microsoft. CSP has been designed for smaller organizations in the beginning who don't want to manage their relationship with Microsoft, who want to be managed by partners. Now, the reality has shown that small organizations sometimes purchase enterprise agreements and very large organizations sometimes purchase CSP because A large organization would sometimes want to benefit from the fact that in CSP you pay as you go. You get an invoice at the end of the month with what you have consumed, as opposed to enterprise agreement where you pay in advance for 1 year, and you have a 3-year contract. Now, in the context of migration, if the organization we move to Azure, we migrate to Azure, already has things in Azure today, right? We have to see exactly how they have purchased Azure before. Was it just, credit card purchase from the website? If so, that's a different billing model, probably a different resource model if that's an old interaction for that company with Azure. So that's a process to migrate to the new Azure. I won't spend too much time here. There's a lot to be discussed, but what I'm trying to say, migrating Azure to Azure could be a process in itself. The big change, which is has just been announced by Microsoft, is they would collapse all those different channels, different possibilities to buy Azure. So from the customer's perspective, it's very complicated. I can go to the website, I can go to Microsoft, I can go to a partner, which is different contracts, different types of billing systems. Now they want to collapse them all in a single model. You have 3 channels in one model, but a single offering, a single purchase experience, acquisition experience, a single portal to purchase from, and a single set of offers. So this is how it will look like. It's already beginning. The customer's experience is a very simplified one because you don't have to deal with all the differences between those actual mechanism you buy Azure from. It's just one mechanism from your perspective, from a single portal. That's a big change. Now, after we migrated to Azure, right? And that's a technical thing we didn't cover too much, but it's complicated and 1 hour is not enough. Our purpose and the customer's purpose is to have peace of mind. This is how we call one of our services. They're in a state where they can feel sure that everything is fine with their Azure workload or cloud workload. So what does usually a managed services provider do for their customer to get peace of mind? Well, it's a lot of things, but I'm going to focus more on governance. So there's support, SLA-based support, proactive maintenance, reactive-based support. There's a lot of things that need to be done, but I'm going to focus on governance because this is one of the most important and complicated when it comes to the modern cloud with Azure, for example. Okay, why do we need governance? Well, because managing the Azure resources can become very, very messy, like a spaghetti, right? Can become very complicated if you don't know what you're doing. You have accounts, you have a tenant, you have accounts, you have subscriptions, you have role-based access control, you have a lot of features in Azure, but they need to be used properly in order to manage those resources. So this is how we organize resources in Azure. You have a tenant, which is an Azure Active Directory and access to Office 365 services. In a tenant, you can define management groups, which are usually a grouping of subscriptions, an abstract, a virtual grouping of subscriptions, and you can apply different policies, different rules per management group. Then you have subscriptions, and then you have resource groups. Now, I've seen a lot of kinds of organization of resources. Some customers that we have, or some companies, used to associate management groups to business groups, to divisions. Some others want cost centers to be there. Subscriptions are usually associated to a solution or a department. So it depends very, very much on the way you decide to split those. Resource groups are grouping of resources which should belong together, which are, by belonging together, I'm thinking about a solution, which may be a version of a solution or a deployment of a solution. Those resources belong together, meaning their life cycle is the same. So when I deploy a new version, I deploy a new version throughout the entire resource group. So management groups simply apply access, so RBAC, policies and compliance across multiple subscriptions, right? What is RBAC? Role-based access control. I can specify what groups of users have what rights, what kind of rights per subscription, per resource group, or per resource, at the resource level, or even at the management group level. Then we have policies, which is a very interesting thing. This is the only cloud provider which has that thing. We can do real-time enforcement of some rules, right? We can do compliance reporting. So I'll give you some examples. You can define a policy which audits machines which don't have disaster recovery configured, or a policy which only allows a set of virtual machines. So whenever a user inside the subscription where this policy at the scope it is applied, so they go to the subscription, they create a new VM, they choose one particular VM type, and if that's not allowed, they're not going to be allowed to continue. So that's a policy which applies before resource creation. And then you have audit policies, which is auditing existing resources. And from, I don't know, time to time, every hour or every day, they execute and they pop up a message somewhere in the dashboard saying, look, you have 3 VMs which don't obey to the rule of having disaster recovery configured, or things like that. Many other examples, including make sure that you have transparent data encryption on all your SQL workloads. So many other things. Now, this I should emphasize this again. This is the only cloud provider which allows you to do that. This is very important for us. I won't spend time on auditing. Blueprints. This is a very interesting thing. Again, the only cloud provider which does that. You can define a blueprint, which is simply put a collection of rules to access resources, so authorization rules, a collection of policies which can be applied at the scope level that you decide. So this is not an ARM template, by the way. An ARM template is a JSON file which specifies a resource group, a grouping of resources. By using an ARM template and executing it, you would create a resource group, a set of resources. A blueprint is something more abstract. It comes above that, and a blueprint can contain an ARM template for resource groups, but it also contains the policies and the access policies, the access rules, the permissions for those resources. So this is the way to create repeatable environments. A blueprint, right? When you execute the blueprint, you will simply, within a subscription, create some resource groups with policies applied to them and with access control applied to them. So this is beautiful. This is very good. There are ways, they're working on it. It's not quite there yet, to integrate blueprints with Azure DevOps. So to automate creating environments completely. There's still some work to be done there. Still at governance, talking about cost control. So cost control is a big problem. As I mentioned before, Azure is beautiful that you pay as much as you need, but only if you do it properly. Meaning there are ways, there are moments where people just create resources and forget about them, right? So cost control is very, very, very important. Then we have different tools. There's the Azure portal, which shows you cost per resource. It's not very useful because if you go into Azure portal and you see the cost per VMs, that doesn't tell you too much. You want to be able to know your cost per solution, your cost per department, your cost per owner, a person who has created those resources, I don't know, per time, and so on and so forth. So what we usually do with our customers, we do a custom dashboard. This is in Power BI, where we define different reports, different groupings of resources, and we list their costs. So we want to know costs per region. We want to know cost per owner, owner being a person in that organization. We want to know cost per resource group. And for such resource group, we also have expiry date, which is not present in this report right now. But that's very useful because whenever somebody from IT sees an expiration date which has passed, there's a red flag over there. And usually we also have alerts giving you messages saying, hey, you have resource groups which have expiration date that passed. So maybe you would consider deleting those resource groups. And then you go inside your organization, you look at the owner, you say, hey, this is the cost for your resource. Do you still need it because it seems to be expired? So you have all those mechanisms, but only if somebody customizes the tools that Azure provides. Now that's cost viewing. Cost control also is very important. You have things like auto scaling, automatically shutting down and starting VMs, reserved instances or reserved resources in general. So many tools and mechanisms to optimize the Azure usage. But yeah, it requires a lot of customization. And just remember this when it comes to cost as well. Whatever I talked before with cost views, cost viewing in the Azure portal, that will change. Meaning today in Azure CSP, so if the customer purchases Azure from a partner, they don't have in their Azure portal visibility over cost in real time. They get it from the partner. That's what we do with our custom Power BI dashboard. But in the future, they will get it inside the portal. So there are changes coming here as well, which is I think it's a good thing for the customers in the end. A very simplified case study. I'll move to the last one. So a software company which is still increasing very fast, with a lot of pressure from sales to be able to create demos from customers instantly. So I'm a salesperson. I go tomorrow to Japan, and I want to be able to, I don't know, show them a demo, which is not deployed anywhere. With a lot of special needs, like I need to be able to create 10,000 VMs tomorrow. They were coming from BizSpark, approaching graduation, meaning the free credit program was going to end. And they had identities everywhere, so multiple identity providers. What did we do with them? We migrated them from the BizSpark pay-as-you-go model to CSP, which was a project which was very successful. Then we reduced their cloud spending almost instantly, a lot. And then we helped them consume Azure as needed. They increased almost 10 times in the meantime, their Azure consumption, but with better structure, better governance, better control over who's doing what and what do we spend on. We also migrated them from G Suite to Office 365. We have consolidated their identities and infrastructure and helped them with automating, dev test, pilot, POC, demo environments. So what they get is, well, control and integration, cost control, identity integration, and their go-to-market, their speed of development and speed for sales, from sales perspective, has increased a lot. This is a typical enterprise which we work with both Office 365 or Microsoft 365 and Azure workloads, and we have to be sure how we work together with those very different technologies. Okay, so we're approaching the end of the hour. We still have time for questions. I try to go through a lot of challenges that we have when customers or organizations ask us to help them migrate to the cloud. I gave you a lot of examples with the Microsoft Cloud because that's what I work on. That's what I do, Azure and Microsoft 365. This is what we do in Avelgo. So a lot of those things come from our experience doing this with customers. So I think we still have time for questions. Please go ahead and ask questions.
Thank you, Mihai, for a great presentation. Yes, we will now have some questions, and if you have any questions from Mihai, please type them into the questions window now. First question, Mihai, how is the Microsoft Commerce MCA change going to affect customers, and how about partners?
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. So the commerce thing which they just announced is going to be very positive for customers. First of all, because customers today see three ways to purchase Azure. One is from the website, one is direct from Microsoft, that would be the enterprise agreement, even though the contract goes through a partner in the end, or through a partner. Whereas the new commerce experience would be a single point, a single portal to purchase Azure and services on top of Azure in a very simple, in a single experience, in a consolidated experience. Now for partners, so companies who rely on the Microsoft distribution channel, of course it has to change, their business has to change to adapt to be able to sell their services through this Microsoft Commerce portal.
Great. Next question, is there a big movement towards the cloud? How and where?
Yeah, so I think what we've seen is a big difference between the US and even UK on one side, and rest of Europe on the other side. Yes, so especially in the US, large organizations have decided to move en masse to the cloud. So the chasm has been crossed. Now we're talking about the majority of the market going towards the cloud, and sometimes they're going entirely to the cloud. They're simply moving everything. Sometimes they are not moving everything because most of the time a hybrid solution is needed. So workloads on premises are still needed today and in the future. I'm talking about banks, healthcare. So there are lots of reasons not to move data into the cloud. And that's why Microsoft, for example, has always tried to keep up with the strategy. So their current strategy today is to support hybrid scenarios. So we have Azure Stack on premises, you have Azure Data Box, a lot of predefined products which leverage those scenarios. So yeah, the cloud is here. It's a very big movement. And it differs from company to company if it's an entire migration to the cloud or it's only partial.
Sure. And the last question, will the slide deck be available? If possible, Mihai, you can send that to me and I will share with everyone that attended today.
Yeah, sure, I'll do that.
Brilliant. And you also have your email address there on screen, Mihai. So if anybody wants to reach out to you, is that okay?
Yeah. I
Super.
encourage people to ask questions, and yeah.
That's brilliant. On behalf of the ESPC community, thank you, Mihai, for taking the time today to complete this webinar. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you, Mihai. Okay, everybody, that is the end of the webinar today. Please see sharepointeurope.com for further details on all upcoming webinars, or visit our resource center where all previous episodes are available. Thank you for joining us today. And again, a big thank you to Mihai Tataran. Take care and goodbye.